I've been working in the sustainability field, believe it or not, for 35 years before we used that term, sustainability. And never in my career have I seen a more dynamic time in this field. We've rebranded it. It's now ESG. But why is it now so big? And the reason is that it's gone from the fringe, where it was all voluntary reporting to kind of bolster the reputation of a company, to crossing the threshold into the mainstream of global commerce. That's the new. That's why we're all here. And it's created all of these policies and standards and frankly, confusion across the board. So what we're going to do today is hopefully try to clarify some of that confusion. We have an amazing panel of experts. My colleagues will introduce themselves in a minute. I will tell you that myself worked for 10 years in the federal government on environmental policy, 20 years in the private sector, all on sustainability, and now with Persephone. But before Persephone, just wedged in there, I was CEO of the Global Reporting Initiative. So I've been involved in this area for quite some time. We have an amazing panel. We're going to dive deep on the SEC rulemaking, which I heard the last panel talk about, but we've got some great people to talk about that, and TCFD and GFANZ. And if you understood all that, you're in the right room. So let me start by asking my panelists to just do a brief introduction, and then we'll walk through some questions. Let's just go down the line. Kristina.
Great. Thanks, Tim. I'm Kristina Wyatt, and I work with Tim at Persephone. I'm a Deputy General Counsel and Senior Vice President for Global Regulatory Climate Disclosure. I came to Persephone because, Tim was there, so how could you be not? I started my career years ago in a company and made my way to the SEC, and then to Latham & Watkins, a large global law firm, where I helped to build their sustainability program and their ESG practice, and then was very fortunate to be invited to join the SEC, working with Satyam right after President Biden was elected. Went over there and worked on climate for about a year, which was the term of the appointment, and then came over to Persephone to really help to accelerate the process of facilitating companies reporting of their greenhouse gases. On to you, Satyam.
Satyam Khanna. I am a fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research and a consultant on my own. Prior to coming here, I was at the SEC under the acting chair at the time. Her name's Allison Lee, for a kind of unique appointment where I spearheaded all her ESG initiatives and had the great honor of working with Kristina, and came across many of you in this room. And after that, I was detailed over to the EPA to help them think through the same issues. But my background, a long background in financial regulatory issues, I worked at the SEC in a prior stint from 2018 to 2019. Before that, I was at the Treasury Department and then a lawyer in private practice before.
Hi, Curtis Ravenel. If there's an acronym in the disclosure space, I was usually involved in some way. So I helped really launch SASB, TCFD, and now GFANZ. And I essentially do whatever Mike Bloomberg, Mark Carney, and Mary Shapiro tell me to do.
Well, as you can see, we got a lot of really in-depth experience. So let's jump right in with the SEC. I think most people have been following this, know that the proposed rule was over 500 pages, got a lot of attention. Some people are saying it's a game changer. SEC has never done anything this big, this sweeping. And if you're following this, you know, somewhat controversial. The comment period closed last week on the 17th, and I believe there were over 10,000 comments submitted. I've heard about 4,000 were original comments, so a lot of sort of cut and paste. But I'd love to turn it to the two panelists that actually worked on the SEC. Tell us what you're seeing in sort of, the debate over the rule right now. What are the big themes? What are the sort of dividing lines coming out right now in terms of that proposal?
Well, I'm happy to start. I think there's sort of two lines of debate. One goes to the legal authority that the SEC has or doesn't have to enact these rules, and I'll leave it to Satyam because he's now a professor to talk about that. And then the other is just sort of the scope of the proposals, whether they go too far, whether they go far enough. And there's certainly a lot of debate about that. We certainly see in the comment letters and here in speaking with people that there's a perception among many that the proposals go way too far in asking for too much in too much detail. Some of the areas that I think are really sort of under attack or under the microscope are Scope 3 reporting, the note to the financial statements that would require tying your climate-related financial risks to your financial statements. There's some concern about the timing of the proposals. So those are, I think, on the concern side. We're certainly also hearing from the investor community that this is well needed and has long been needed. And I think there is quite a bit of applause at the fact that the proposal really ties quite closely to two very important frameworks. One is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the greenhouse gas accounting standard. And then the other is the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is the framework that guides companies in thinking about their climate-related financial risks. And I will say that Curtis was on speed dial when we were working on this at the SEC and was incredibly generous with his time and incredible expertise as we tried to figure out, how do we hew closely to the best of the TCFD. On to you, Satyam, maybe on the whatever you want to talk about, but certainly the authority issues I think are interesting.
Kristina has nicely laid out and delineated that the debate over this rule is sort of bifurcated. One is on policy design. What is this rule too much, too fast? And exactly as she said. The other is on legal authority. And the reason why the legal authority issue is important is because, well, we've all been following the Supreme Court these days. The courts are taking an increasingly skeptical view of administrative actions. And so these questions become front and center when you're thinking about, frankly, any agency's rulemakings coming out of the federal government these days. In particular, on the SEC, there have been questions raised from mainly conservative legal circles and some business interests that the SEC doesn't have authority to promulgate climate-related disclosures under its statutes. And one thing that I was struck by in reading this file and getting through some of the comments is that the sheer asymmetry of responses and from different ideological parts of the political spectrum saying, no, the SEC, you can debate policy all day, but the SEC clearly has authority to be in the space. It can and it should be in the space. There were letters from bipartisan groups of former SEC officials who agree on very little in terms of securities law policy, including your boss, Harvey Pitt, Arthur Levitt, former securities law scholars, administrative law scholars, constitutional law scholars, and a number of practitioners from places like Wachtell Lipton who were saying that we all disagree on what this rule is and how it should be designed. But on questions of legal authority, the SEC is rightfully in this space and has promulgated a rule that is a reasonable exercise of that authority. So that asymmetry, there's the number of scholars and experts who are saying that the SEC has authority is one takeaway that I have here. And I would just urge you all to keep that in mind as this debate on legal authority continues. What I hope happens is that this comment file puts that debate to rest. And you can move on to questions of policy design, as Kristina outlined. But hope springs eternal these days in Washington.
Well, I want to come back to the SEC, but before we do, I want to bring Curtis into the conversation because, this rule didn't just appear out of thin air. The SEC has been talking about it for 12 years, maybe longer. First guidance was out in 2010. There were several warnings. But in around 2015, there was the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And I know, Curtis, you were very involved in that.
Just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it?
It does.
Task Force.
TCFD. You really need to work on your acronyms. TCFD is not only sort of the backbone of the SEC rule, but it's also the backbone of many of the other policies that we're seeing emerge around the world from Europe and other capital markets. And so I'd love if, Curtis, if you could just kind of tell us a little bit of the history of TCFD and where you see it kind of maybe clarifying the alphabet soup a little bit as we go forward.
Yeah, I mean, look, the TCFD, I jokingly say the TCFD didn't actually invent anything. We just, I think the TCFD was successful for a few reasons. One, it was the FSB sanctioned this, actually created this private sector-led task force. So the Financial Stability Board is basically the regulators from the G20, so it's Treasury, SEC, and the Fed in the case of the U.S. And so when they put forward a private sector-led task force, I jokingly call that they're voluntold to participate. So that was one. Number two, we did try to simplify this whole structure with governance, strategy, risk, metrics, and targets. That's a very framework that's not really climate specific, but it's how businesses operate. We wanted to make sure that climate wasn't something firms were doing off to the side. Three, we wrote it we got rid of as much climate speak as we could and really tried to make it focused on financial impact and materiality. That was the remit. It wasn't about how are you impacting the climate. It was much more about how climate may impact your business. And the final, but most important also, is we had some really strong, well-known surrogates in Mike, Mary, and Mark. They're banned, by the way. And that really helped a lot. And then you also, because it was flexible, these guys' jobs was frankly harder. Because it was scalable, flexible, private sector led, it was sort of principles based. It allowed a lot of companies and financial institutions to experiment, right? And you learn by doing. And we had, 5-6 years of experimentation that kind of, I always think that standard setters, regulators, and legislators, those are the different groups, right? The ISSB is a standard setter. The EU is a legislator. And then the SEC is a regulator. They're like Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold. They don't want to be too far behind the market, but they don't want to be too far ahead of the market. And so I think that gestation period of 5 years allowed it for this moment to happen.
Terrific. Well, let's go back to the SEC rule, but I want to bring you back in on GFANZ after this. But as we look at the SEC, again, sweeping rule, controversial, people questioning the authority. Play out for me a couple of things. One, what happens next, right? So the rule is we're done with the comment period. What can we expect in terms of the actual rulemaking process? And then two, what should companies and financial institutions be doing to prepare? And you guys can bounce off each other however you want.
Go for it.
Okay, so, the SEC, clearly the staff right now is busily reading these comment letters. It's a big job. And they are statutorily bound to read the comment letters and to consider them in the final rulemaking. The final rule will address the comments, not necessarily each and every one of them, but will certainly take into account the comments, and particularly so in the economic analysis. So that the comment process is vitally important. The staff is clearly, not sleeping a lot right now, I'm sure, working through these comment letters. I think it's clear that the chair wants to get a final rule out quickly. So, there's some pressure to do that. I think they're going to.
Before the midterms was the comment.
Yeah, and I think the indicative timeline in the proposal as to the implementation dates indicated it was sort of on the assumption that the final rules would come out during 2022 and pointed to calendar year companies. And I haven't heard anything to indicate that they're changing that kind of indicative timeline, but that certainly would be very aggressive, no doubt about it. Do you want to chime in?
Yeah, so agree completely with Kristina. My sense is that the chair and the commissioners want to finalize this proposal as soon as possible. But I think, so essentially what happens is the rules proposed, we go through comments, the staff will digest these thousands of comments. The record on this rule, both before, when I was at the SEC, we put out a request for information, which many of you commented on. And the record now in the proposal is just incredibly rich. I don't know that there's been as rich of a record going into an SEC rulemaking and during the rulemaking ever. It's just remarkable. And so the SEC is in a good position to have a lot of information to produce a really good final rule. That final rule will happen, I think, later this year. It's anyone's guess. And then the big question is what happens in the federal courts. And that's a whole nother conversation, but that is kind of lorded over this debate, as I mentioned, on legal authority. So this is the timeline, but I generally think the SEC is going to move as fast as it can, but fully knowing that the SEC is extremely under-resourced and strapped thin and has been like that way for decades. And so, they may take some time to digest comments and things like that too.
And in terms of what companies should be doing now, there are 3 proposals that are out. Well, there are actually more because there are 3 SEC proposals, but on corporate disclosures, there's an SEC proposal, there's an ISSB, International Sustainability Standards Board proposal, and an FRAG proposal that are currently outstanding for comment. And I think that, some companies might think that it would be wise to just sort of wait and see how everything kind of hashes out before really taking action to start to get ready to disclose. And I would say that that's probably not a great idea. And getting back to the importance of having a common through line in the form of the greenhouse gas protocol, the accounting standard for greenhouse gas measurement, and the TCFD, those permeate, even though all 3 proposals are quite different, and the ultimate details of the proposals, when adopted, will be different than what the proposals are necessarily. But there is that common through line of greenhouse gas protocol and TCFD. So what I would encourage companies to do is to start to get ready by preparing your greenhouse gas inventory using the greenhouse gas protocol and preparing to report on your and to manage your climate-related financial risks and opportunities, building your governance structures, evaluating your risks, looking at your opportunities, building your strategies, all of those things that are really a common baseline across all of these proposals. So I would say don't wait, get started.
Yeah. I just would add that, if you do any business in Europe, you're going to get captured by this. So, and once ISSB rolls out too, so I agree. You got to build capacity, now for this.
Yeah, I agree. You shouldn't be betting on the SEC's success or failure. You should be looking at the bigger picture. The trend lines are there. To Curtis's point, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, another great abbreviation, CSRD, captures companies over 150 million of turnover in Europe, whether you're based there or not. So to your point, it's going to bring in a lot of folks.
And there's GFANZ.
Well, we're going to GFANZ. GFANZ, the world's worst acronym.
It's a boy band.
Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Announced at Glasgow, hence the G, about 8 months ago, I guess now. Tremendous step forward. But I want to sort of set the context and then turn it over to Curtis to explain it. To me, whether or not you're focused on the SEC or CSRD or you name the abbreviation acronym, the driving force has been investors. We have 92% of the S&P 500 reporting sustainability information. The only thing that's different is now the investment community woke up to the fact that this information has value to identify risks and opportunities. The problem is the voluntary markets, that information is kind of sketchy, right? It's reported at different times, different qualities. It's not comparable. It's not audited and assured. All of that is what's going on here. Investor pressure is the megatrend that's pushing all of this. So GFANZ, I think, is the highest articulation of that investor pressure as sustainability has crossed the threshold into the mainstream of the global economy. So I know you were an insider on GFANZ. Hopefully you didn't create the acronym because it's awful.
No.
But I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts about GFANZ and where it's going.
No, I've been, unfortunately, a taker of all those acronyms, not a maker. So, yeah, I mean, GFANZ is really trying to be, it's an alliance of alliances. So just a quick way of background, the UN FCCC created this Race to Zero campaign. And it's based essentially on, being net zero by 2050, having interim targets by 2030 that represent the fair share of 50% reduction that we need by then. And you need to set targets against low or no overshoot benchmarks, for lack of a better, more specific term, meaning you need to stay within the pathway. And so GFANZ does not set the criteria, but we're trying to make sure that we didn't have a splintered activity across the financial sector, because you have a net zero asset manager alliance, owner alliance, insurance alliance, investment consultants alliance. And so GFANZ really kind of works to coordinate across those on what we call pan-sector activity. And the rest is really handled by those individual alliances, and many of you in the room are members of them. It is intentionally different than the other stuff that I've worked on. SASB and TCFD were sort of it was really all about risk identification and opportunities, right? But this is saying I'm intending to align my financing activities with the goals of the Paris Agreement. It's an impact play. You're agreeing to do that. Now, we all know the financial industry can't do that alone. They need the policy support. They need real economy to move forward. But this is intended to signal the finance community's here. They want to be catalytic. And they frankly want to give some courage to the policymakers where it's not been shown, right? Especially in the US. Like, you can't get there without the policy. That being said, just for fun, we put out a consultation in mid-June too, because you don't have enough already. The one thing that we kind of identified as a cross-area thing was the need for sort of robust transition plans. Like, it's one thing to make a commitment and set a target, but like, how the hell are you going to get there? So you need to tell us. So we worked with a lot of different GFANZ members and came up with what we think is a robust sort of transition planning framework that is now out for consultation, and we'll come back by COP with something final. It's kind of the TCFD playbook, honestly. If you look at the SEC, EFRAG, and the ISSB, they all mention transition plans in their proposed standards, but there's not a whole lot of meat on the bone, if you will, about what that looks like, what would that really entail. So in the same way that TCFD provided the private sector view on what good looks like for climate disclosure, and then having the regulators run ahead with turning it into something real and actionable and baseline and level setting. These proposed regulations, unlike TCFD, we were kind of hoping they would eventually get regulated. This is actually in proposals. So this is our attempt to provide the private sector view. You are the private sector, financial sector view, and so we would encourage you to, add it to your list of consultation responses that you need to do, because I think it'll be foundational, like TCFD was to climate risk, establishing climate risk, financial risk. Transition plans are really going to be foundational to net zero.
Well, thank you. And we're down to our last couple of minutes. So I just want to ask the panel, for their one sentence piece of clarity and inspiration in this highly confused and highly dynamic world that we're walking into. So one sentence. I told you all about it before, so you should have practiced. And I think we'll finish on time. So Kristina, you get to go first.
One sentence. Don't try to boil the ocean. Start with the framework. This is more than one sentence. But as you think about
Long sentence.
a long sentence, there's semicolons. So obviously every company is in a different place in terms of its reporting journey. I would start with benchmarking to see where you are. And then let's say you're just starting at the very beginning. I would start at a high level to understand your macro level risks and opportunities, and then drill down from there. Don't worry too much about all the little details. Just get started and start at a higher level, and there will always be details you can drill down to.
Build the foundation first. I love it. Satyam.
Start early. start now. No matter what happens with these rules, this debate, and this issue is not going away. As Tim said, this is driven by investors, and no matter what happens in Washington, this will still be an issue. You have to start now.
Excellent. Curtis, last word.
Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
That's fantastic. And you really hit that one sentence mark.
Try to follow the rules, man.
Yeah, I love it. Well, look, I think we had a great discussion. Obviously, we could have gone on for a lot longer. There's a lot here. But please join me in thanking this fantastic panel for shedding some light on this really important area.